The other day, I was sitting across from a friend at a quiet sunlit cafe. The music was soft. The espresso machine was humming. It was the picture of a relaxing afternoon. My friend was casually scrolling through their phone, catching up on the morning news. But within just a few minutes, I watched a bizarre physical transformation take place right in front of me. Their breathing became noticeably shallow, almost like they were struggling to catch air. Their jaw locked, and the knuckles of the hand gripping the phone turned completely white. When the barista gently set down a water glass near our table, my friend physically flinched, practically jumping out of their chair. It was as if they were bracing for an immediate physical attack. I asked if everything was all right. They looked up, eyes darting and totally unfocused, and immediately snapped at me, their voice trembling with a mix of agitation and panic. "How can anything be all right? Did you see the updates? The whole system is collapsing." What struck me wasn't the geopolitical news they were reading. It was the sheer biological intensity of their reaction. They were sitting in a perfectly safe room, yet their body was responding as if a predator had just breached the door. When I tried to gently suggest they put the phone away and look at the actual room we were in, they bristled, entirely incapable of processing any logic or reassurance. That stark disconnect, the physical safety of our environment versus the absolute state of mobilization happening inside their nervous system, made me realize something critical. When we consume global crises through a screen, our bodies don't just worry, they biologically hijack us. And it begs the question, why does trying to rationalize or think our way out of this panic almost always fail? And what is actually taking over our bodies the moment we read the news?
To really answer that, we have to kind of leave the public setting of that cafe. We need to look at the private, entirely unseen spaces where this biological override actually happens most intensely. Because the architecture of this response is, well, it's completely subconscious.
Right.
And it operates with this terrifying mechanical efficiency, often in the quietest, most isolated hours of the night.
Yeah, the isolation makes it so much worse. I mean, think about your own phone habits late at night and just consider this reality. It's, say, 3:14 a.m. The digital clock on the nightstand is bleeding this faint red color, but Elias's face is painted in that harsh, sterile blue of his smartphone.
Right.
And on the screen, a city half a world away is crumbling. He swipes.
Notice the physical environment there, right? At 3:14 a.m., your circadian rhythms are strictly dictating sleep. The physical body is horizontal. You're wrapped in blankets in a dark room.
Completely vulnerable.
Exactly. Yet the optic nerve is receiving this direct beam of blue light, which, immediately suppresses melatonin production. And simultaneously, it's delivering catastrophic visual data to the brain.
Right, and the data just keeps coming. I mean, an economic graph points sharply toward an abyss. He swipes again.
Yeah.
A thread of, panicked predictions about an upcoming election appears. And the thing is, Elias is a high school history teacher.
Right, he knows better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His waking hours are spent lecturing on the cyclical nature of human folly. His rational mind, his prefrontal cortex, knows that staring at this illuminated glass is not going to change the trajectory of artillery shells or market indices.
And this is exactly where the internal fracture happens, because Elias possesses immense intellectual capacity, right? He understands history, statistics, probability,
Right.
But in this exact moment, his intellect is, well, it's entirely irrelevant to his physiological state.
Because logic tells him to put the phone down, close his eyes,
Right.
just sleep. But that logic is like a faint dying radio signal. His thumb moves with this rhythmic, compulsive twitch, just pulling down to refresh the feed. His chest feels tight, like a band of iron ratcheting down over his ribs.
Yeah.
And he doesn't even realize he's holding his breath until a sharp ache in his lungs forces this shallow gasp.
Yeah, and that gasp, that is the defining marker of the biological hijack. What Elias is experiencing right there in that bed is the raw neurobiology of doomscrolling. His nervous system is entirely consumed by this ancient evolutionary mandate to scan the horizon for predators.
So let's break down that mechanism, because, when you say his nervous system is a scanning, we almost always think of that as a conscious choice, right? We think Elias is actively, deliberately choosing to look for danger.
Right. But that isn't what's happening here at all. The fundamental mechanism at play here is what neuroscientist Stephen Porges coined as neuroception.
Neuroception.
And it is absolutely critical to differentiate neuroception from perception, because perception requires conscious cognitive awareness. You perceive that the wall is painted white. You perceive the coffee is hot.
You're thinking about it.
Exactly. But neuroception operates entirely beneath the threshold of conscious thought.
So it's essentially a background process, like the nervous system continuously, relentlessly scanning the environment for cues of safety or danger or life threat without any input from our thinking brain whatsoever.
And it happens exponentially faster than conscious thought. When Elias looks at a screen, the sequence of events is strictly biological. It begins the literal millisecond the eyes take in the visual data.
The text, the graphs, the images of destruction.
Right. The optic nerve takes that data and transmits it to the thalamus, which is essentially the brain's central relay station.
And normally, the thalamus would send that information up to the visual cortex and then to the prefrontal cortex, right? So we can consciously evaluate it. We can say, this is a picture on a screen. I'm safe in my bed.
Exactly. That is the slow pathway. But in cases of severe perceived threat, the thalamus completely bypasses that slow pathway. It routes the signal directly to the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center.
Wow. Directly to the alarm bell.
Exactly. So before the prefrontal cortex can even form a coherent sentence about what Elias is seeing, the autonomic nervous system runs a threat assessment and registers absolute immediate danger.
That sequence it's honestly alarming, because it means the body mobilizes before the mind even knows what is going on. The heart rate spikes to pump blood to the major muscle groups, digestion halts to conserve energy, and breathing becomes shallow and rapid. So Elias's chest feels tight because his intercostal muscles are literally bracing for a physical impact.
The cortisol and adrenaline are already flooding his bloodstream, and it's only in the final step of the sequence, after the body has fully armored itself for combat, that the conscious mind even receives the signal.
Really, the feeling of anxiety comes after the physical armor.
Yes. The prefrontal cortex finally comes online, looks at the pounding heart and the shallow breath, and interprets this overwhelming physiological shift as the emotion of anxiety or panic.
So the mobilization happens first. The feeling of terror is just the cognitive aftermath.
Exactly.
This highlights such a profound evolutionary mismatch. I mean, think about the hardware we are working with here. The human brain, as you're describing it, literally cannot distinguish between a rustling bush in the Pleistocene era and like a flashing push notification in the 21st century.
Biologically speaking, there is zero difference. The alarm system evolved to detect movement, sharp contrast, and signs of violence or instability in the immediate environment.
Right.
So a timeline full of breaking news alerts perfectly mimics the visual and cognitive cues of a predator rapidly approaching.
But if we know this is a biological hardware issue, if we know it's a strictly physiological response, why do we constantly blame our lack of willpower?
Oh, constantly.
Right. Like when you are scrolling late at night and you can't put the phone down, the overriding feeling isn't, my biology is responding optimally. This is, I lack discipline. I should be able to just put this phone away.
We blame willpower because society severely overestimates the authority of the prefrontal cortex during a state of biological mobilization.
Yeah.
Well, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functioning, logic, long-term planning, impulse control. It's a highly evolved but incredibly metabolically expensive piece of neural machinery.
Meaning it requires a lot of energy and oxygen to run.
Correct. So when neuroception detects a severe immediate threat, the nervous system basically deems the prefrontal cortex far too slow and too costly to rely on for survival.
It shuts it down.
Yes. Survival requires immediate reflexive action, not careful rumination. Therefore, blood flow and glucose are literally diverted away from the prefrontal cortex and redirected down to the amygdala and the brainstem.
Wow. So Elias isn't failing a test of willpower at all. His neurological hardware has quite literally taken his willpower offline to prioritize his survival.
Exactly.
He is trapped in a perpetual state of threat monitoring, leaving only this mobilized, terrified animal lying perfectly still beneath a weighted blanket. Completely paralyzed by a war it can't even fight.
And paralyzed is the exact clinical reality here. The cognitive demand from his dying prefrontal cortex to just stop scrolling is biologically impossible to execute.
Because to the body, looking away is fatal.
Right. His nervous system firmly believes that if he takes his eyes off the threat, if he puts the phone face down on the nightstand, he will be immediately killed by the predator he's tracking.
To really understand how deep this paralysis goes, we need to map out the underlying architecture governing these reactions, which brings us directly to the autonomic nervous system and the polyvagal theory. Because everything we're taught about the nervous system usually boils down to a really simple binary switch, right? Like you were either resting or you were in fight or flight.
And Polyvagal Theory, which was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, completely dismantles that binary model. It reveals that the fight or flight versus rest and digest paradigm is an incomplete and, frankly, dangerously oversimplified picture of human neurobiology.
Because we're actually dealing with 3 distinct states, not 2.
We are dealing with 3 distinct hierarchical nervous system states.
Let's walk through that hierarchy. Let's start from the top. The state where we are actually meant to spend most of our lives. The ventral vagal state.
The ventral vagal state is our biological baseline for safety and social engagement. It is governed by the myelinated portion of the vagus nerve, which is an evolutionary newer pathway.
Okay.
When you are in this state, you feel calm, present, grounded. Your heart rate is variable, meaning it subtly speeds up when you inhale and slows down when you exhale. And crucially, your prefrontal cortex is fully accessible.
This is the state where Elias can effectively teach history to his students, right? Or where you can have a deep conversation with a friend. Or even where you can just safely digest your food.
It is the only state in which true physiological healing, deep learning, and rational thought can occur. But it requires the fundamental neuroception of safety.
But the moment that safety is compromised, the exact moment the news alert flashes on the screen, the system instantly downshifts into the second state, the sympathetic state.
The mobilization response. The sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system takes over, and this is characterized by the racing heart, tense musculature, hypervigilance, and that relentless scanning for danger we just analyzed. It is the classic fight-or-flight activation.
And we really need to emphasize something crucial here. We often pathologize anxiety. We treat this sympathetic state as if it is a disease, like something is broken, but it's not pathological at all, is it?
Not in its design, no. The sympathetic state is an incredibly adaptive, evolutionarily brilliant response. It's designed to prepare the body for immediate, life-saving physical action.
Like running from a bear.
Or if a car swerves into your lane, you want your sympathetic nervous system to flood your body with adrenaline so you can violently wrench the steering wheel. It is meant to save your life.
But there is a third state, and this is the one people don't talk about enough. What happens when the fight or flight response fails? Or, like with the news, what happens when the threat is perceived as so massive, so inescapable, that fighting or running is literally impossible?
That's when the nervous system drops into the third and most primitive state, the dorsal vagal state. This is the biological shutdown.
Shutdown.
It is governed by the unmyelinated older branch of the vagus nerve. It's a state of immobilization characterized by feeling numb, disconnected, dissociated, and just profoundly exhausted.
It's the physiological equivalent of, like, a mouse going limp in the jaws of a cat.
Exactly. It's a last resort preservation mechanism. The metabolism plummets, the heart rate drops dangerously low, pain receptors are actually blunted through the release of endogenous opioids, and the individual feels completely severed from reality.
Wow. So if you cannot fight and you cannot flee, the body's final strategy is to simply shut down and wait for death, minimizing suffering as much as possible. So if we apply this 3-state architecture directly to the modern news cycle, we see a really specific, devastating biological trap. I mean, let's trace a standard daily routine. You wake up, you grab your phone off the nightstand, and you do a quick morning check of the headline.
Right.
That instantly triggers sympathetic activation, a spike of cortisol to start the day.
Your body is immediately placed on a low-grade war footing.
Then, on your lunch break, you do a midday check. You read about further military escalations or a localized economic crash or, a new public health warning that compounds the activation. You are stacking a brand new stress response on top of an already dysregulated vibrating system.
And then comes the evening scroll,
Okay.
which sustains that mobilization deep into the night because the autonomic nervous system cannot differentiate between an actual present danger in your physical room, news about danger happening in another hemisphere, or pure speculation about future danger.
It treats it all as immediate threat.
Yes. So the sympathetic state remains permanently engaged.
So if Elias is lying in bed and his body firmly believes he's running from a bear, I mean, his heart is pounding, his muscles are flooded with glucose, his blood pressure is elevated, but he's not running. He's completely motionless under a blanket. Biologically, where does all that unspent chemical and electrical fuel actually go? It can't just evaporate.
It absolutely does not evaporate. That undischarged survival energy turns entirely inward. It remains trapped within the physical architecture of the body.
Trapped where?
Well, the glucose that was mobilized for the leg muscles to sprint is never utilized. The cortisol continues to circulate in the bloodstream long after its half-life should have expired.
And what does that do to the physical tissue?
It gets locked into the musculature, specifically the deep fascial layers. The psoas muscles, the deep core muscles that connect the lumbar spine to the legs, which are responsible for pulling the knees to the chest in a fetal position or a sprint, they remain chronically tight. The diaphragm becomes restricted, leading to permanent shallow chest breathing. And neurologically, the persistent flooding of stress hormones literally damages the hippocampus, which impairs your ability to form new memories and contextualize threats.
So the body basically becomes a holding cell for all this explosive energy.
The amygdala remains locked in a state of hyperreactivity. This chronic dysregulation means the nervous system entirely loses its flexibility.
Oh, it can't shift gears anymore.
Exactly. It forgets how to find its way back up the hierarchy to the ventral vagal stead of safety. The world is no longer processed through the lens of connection. Every neutral stimulus, a loud noise, an unexpected email, a knock at the door, is instantly filtered through a biological imperative of impending doom.
I really want to look closely at what this chronic deterioration actually looks like in a normal person's life. How does this constant marinating in stress hormones fundamentally rewrite a person's baseline? We need to look at secondary trauma. Let's examine this specific reality. It's just a broken plate, Maya said, her voice trembling.
Right. Focus on the physical cues there. What is your body actually doing?
She is staring at the ceramic shards on her kitchen floor. Her husband, who had just dropped the plate while unloading the dishwasher, is looking at her with this mixture of concern and absolute exhaustion. Maya's hands are shaking violently. Her heart is hammering against her sternum like a trapped bird.
A completely maximal sympathetic response to a totally benign household accident.
And Maya is a digital archivist for a major human rights organization. She works in suburban Seattle. She spends 8 hours a day safely seated in a highly ergonomic chair, verifying user-generated footage of human rights abuses from conflict zones.
Right.
There's absolutely no physical danger in her environment. The air conditioning hums smoothly, her coffee sits worn on her desk, yet for months her sympathetic nervous system has been absorbing this trauma.
And this is the essence of secondary traumatic stress. The nervous system does not care that the violence is on a liquid crystal display. The visual and auditory input of human suffering, explosions, and panic goes straight to the amygdala.
The secondary trauma had entirely rewritten her neuroception. The world had become fundamentally unsafe. And 2 days later, sitting in her therapist's office, Maya wept from this deep, shameful place.
"I have no right to feel this destroyed," she said. "I'm not the one in the rubble, I'm just looking at the pictures."
That statement is the core tragedy of secondary trauma. The cognitive brain attempts to logically compare suffering while the nervous system is already bleeding out.
And the therapist mapped it out perfectly. The therapist said, your thinking brain knows you're in Seattle, but your nervous system is in the war zone. It doesn't understand screens. It only understands the cues of terror you feed it all day long. When that plate broke, your body didn't hear ceramic, it heard a gunshot. It is simply trying to keep you alive.
What the therapist is describing there is a clinical concept pioneered by psychiatrist Dan Siegel. It's known as the window of tolerance. And this is the framework we use to understand Maya's extreme reaction to the broken plate. Let's unpack the window of tolerance, because it sounds like a psychological boundary, but it's actually a very rigid physiological zone, isn't it?
It is entirely physiological. The window of tolerance represents the optimal zone of nervous system arousal, where a person can function effectively.
Okay.
When you are inside this window, you can process complex emotions, handle ordinary stress, integrate new information, and remain grounded in the present moment. Your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are basically dancing smoothly together.
But chronic stress, and specifically the relentless secondary trauma Maya absorbs through her screen every single day, aggressively narrows this window.
Yes.
The physical parameters of what her nervous system can tolerate are shrinking.
Drastically shrinking. Because her system is continuously flooded with the neurochemistry of threat, her baseline of arousal is elevated to the absolute upper limit of her window. She is waking up already hovering at the edge of panic.
Which pushes her into a state of hyperarousal, pushing above the window. When you are in hyperarousal, the margin for error is exactly zero. The hypervigilance, the racing thoughts, the exaggerated startle response, she is a coiled spring.
Yes, because her window of tolerance has shrunk to practically nothing, a completely innocuous event, a plate shattering on the floor, breaches her capacity instantly. Her nervous system is already primed for catastrophe. It cannot pause to process context. It reacts with a maximal life-saving survival response.
It's like a seismograph that has been calibrated so sensitively with the internal dial turned up so high that a heavy delivery truck driving down the suburban street registers on the machine as an 8.0.
The machine Maya's nervous system is accurately reporting the data it receives based on its current calibration. But the calibration itself has been profoundly distorted by chronic exposure to digital trauma.
But here is the critical contradiction that I think plagues so many people. Maya feels immense, crushing guilt. She tells her therapist she has no right to feel destroyed because she isn't the one experiencing the physical violence. Why does this mismatch, the undeniable physical safety of her suburban environment versus the absolute biological panic of her internal state, produce such profound shame for the individual?
The shame arises from a societal failure. Our culture rigidly demands that we use intellect and logic to govern our emotional and physical states. We are taught mind over matter.
Right, just calm down.
Exactly. But in this biological arena, logic completely, utterly fails.
Because the prefrontal cortex, the part of her that can assess geopolitical realities, the part that can logically compare her physical safety to those in actual war zones, is completely offline during hyperarousal.
Exactly. But society, and Maya herself, expects her cognitive mind to just step in and override her biology.
Yeah.
When she inevitably fails to do so because you literally cannot outthink a flood of adrenaline, she internalizes that failure as a moral or psychological weakness. She believes she is broken.
Demanding that the body just calm down, or telling oneself other people have it much worse, is biologically impossible to process when the body is locked in survival mode. The thinking brain cannot be reasoned with if the nervous system has not first been provided with a visceral, physiological experience of safety.
Which is why Maya's relief in the therapist's office does not come from the therapist rationally explaining why she shouldn't be afraid.
Right.
It comes only when Maya stops trying to logic her way out of the panic. She finally stops invalidating her body's response, places a hand over her racing heart, and acknowledges the raw physical reality of her biological activation, free from the punishing weight of her guilt.
But we really have to explore what happens when that chronically narrowed window of tolerance finally shatters completely. If Maya's state of hyperarousal is the nervous system fighting desperately against the threat, what occurs when the nervous system eventually decides the fight is lost? We move from frantic hyperarousal to a much darker, quieter place, the terrifying silence of hyperarousal.
This is the shift from the sympathetic mobilization response directly into the dorsal vagal immobilization response. And it is a profound drop.
Consider the reality of David. The collective societal trauma of the past 2 years had not ended in an explosion, but in a long, suffocating whimper. David is a nurse who had worked through the rolling waves of hospital surges, the unending shifts, and the supply chain collapses.
Notice the duration of the stress there. This isn't an acute event. This is years of relentless, high-stakes demand on his sympathetic nervous system.
And eventually, that chronic stress broke right through the floor of his anxiety and dropped into the dark basement of the dorsal vagal response. A complete, numbing shutdown. It is a Tuesday morning. The news playing softly in the background speaks of new variants and crippling inflation, but David feels absolutely nothing.
The absence of feeling is the clinical hallmark here.
The anxiety that used to propel him out of bed, the cortisol that used to force him to move, has burned out entirely, leaving a heavy, leaden apathy. He sits on the edge of the bathtub, staring blankly at the beige tiles. His window of tolerance has shrunk to the size of a pinhole. Any demand, a text message from a friend, a water bill, even the thought of making breakfast feels physically insurmountable.
David has entered hyperarousal, dropping completely below the window of tolerance. When the sympathetic nervous system has exhausted all its metabolic resources, when the neuroception of threat is chronic, inescapable, and utterly overwhelming, the body triggers its absolute biological failsafe.
It initiates the freeze, the dissociative response, and it is critical to separate this from sadness.
Yes, this is not typical clinical depression or mere sadness. It is a profound physiological shutdown.
How does it work physically?
The parasympathetic nervous system, via the unmyelinated dorsal vagus, basically slams the brakes on the entire organism. The heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, the digestive system halts, and emotional numbness sets in. There is a total detachment from oneself and the surrounding reality.
It is an adaptation designed to minimize physical and psychological suffering during what the body perceives as an unavoidable death.
It's a state of deep conservation. Even the smallest demand, like making a piece of toast, feels impossible because the autonomic nervous system simply will not allocate the metabolic resources required to execute the action. It is reserving every ounce of energy for basic organ function during a perceived collapse.
But David remembers a somatic experiencing rule a colleague had taught him. He remembers the phrase, "You cannot think your way out of a shutdown. You have to shock the system back online." So slowly, mechanically, he turns the bathtub faucet to the coldest setting. He cups his hands, fills them with the freezing tap water, and plunges his face directly into it.
An incredibly precise, if intense, intervention.
The shock is instantaneous and violent. He gasps, water dripping down his chin and soaking the collar of his shirt. For a split second, the gray fog of dissociation shatters. His skin stings, his lungs expand sharply, and the sheer biting reality of the cold forces his nervous system to immediately register the present moment. He lets out a low, vibrating hum from the back of his throat. It's a crude, unpracticed attempt at vocal toning. It doesn't cure the world outside his bathroom, but looking up at his dripping reflection, he feels a faint warmth in his chest. The ice is cracked, and the biology of that is fascinating. We really need to examine the biology of this, because the intervention David uses seems incredibly extreme. Plunging your face into freezing water is a violent shock to the system. Isn't it dangerous or highly counterproductive to violently shock an already traumatized, exhausted nervous system? Why does extreme cold suddenly override such profound leaden apathy?
It overrides the apathy because it is a targeted physiological hack that exploits a deeply embedded evolutionary reflex. When David plunges his face into freezing water, he's not just waking himself up, he triggers what is known as the mammalian dive reflex.
The mammalian dive reflex, this is an adaptation found in all mammals, right? From whales to humans.
Exactly. It is designed to optimize respiration and conserve oxygen when submerged in cold water. The moment freezing water hits the thermal receptors on the face, specifically those clustered around the trigeminal nerve, which covers the forehead, cheeks, and jaw, the body forcefully and instantly activates the vagus nerve.
So the temperature change sends a massive electrical signal straight to the brainstem.
Yes. This rapid activation forces an immediate physiological override. It induces bradycardia, rapidly slowing the heart rate, and causes peripheral vasoconstriction, shifting blood flow away from the limbs and directly to the brain and the heart. This massive systemic reboot violently pulls the autonomic nervous system out of the dorsal vagal shutdown. It forces a physiological reorientation to the immediate present physical environment.
Because you cannot be dissociated when your body believes it is submerged in freezing water.
Right.
It forces presence. It bypasses the paralyzed cognitive mind entirely. You cannot think your way out of dorsal collapse because the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex is severely restricted. But the dive reflex forces a massive reboot of the autonomic state, cracking the ice of dissociation just enough to let a sliver of awareness back in.
It creates a momentary window of physiological regulation. It allows David to take his next breath consciously.
Which brings us to the actual mechanisms of long-term recovery. We are moving from David's desperate, ad hoc cold water immersion in his bathroom to the established clinical frameworks that utilize the exact same principle, using the body to heal the mind. If the trauma is stored in the physiology, the intervention must be physiological.
And this is the foundational premise of all bottom-up interventions. When dealing with autonomic dysregulation, top-down therapies like traditional cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy, which rely heavily on the prefrontal cortex analyzing thoughts, they're often completely ineffective in the acute stage.
Because the thinking brain is offline.
Exactly. They are ineffective because the requisite brain regions, the logic centers, are functionally offline.
It's like trying to run a heavy, complex software program when your computer's CPU is severely overheating. Talk therapy, making meaning out of trauma, is the software. It's necessary for long-term integration. But these somatic interventions are the cooling fan. You have to cool the hardware down. You have to regulate the biological nervous system before the cognitive software can even load without crashing the whole system.
Analogy. We must work from the bottom up. Body first, brainstem second, cognitive brain third. Two of the most clinically robust frameworks for cooling this hardware down are somatic experiencing, or SE, developed by Dr. Peter Levine, and the Safe and Sound Protocol, or SSP, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges.
Let's break down somatic experiencing first. The core objective of SE is facilitating the completion of self-protective motor responses. We discussed earlier how sympathetic energy, the urge to run or fight, gets permanently trapped in the body's fascia when we doomscroll because we remain completely still.
Right. SC works by tracking those subtle physical sensations, the body memory, and allowing that trapped survival energy to safely discharge. It does not focus on retelling the traumatic story, which often just re-triggers the amygdala.
Use a process called pendulation. Can you explain the mechanics of pendulation?
Sure. Pendulation involves a practitioner guiding the nervous system to consciously, slowly cycle between states of expansion, which is a feeling of safety or neutrality in the body, and contraction, which is the physical sensation of the trauma activation.
Moving back and forth.
Right. By moving back and forth in tiny, manageable increments, the nervous system gradually builds the capacity to process the bound energy without being thrown violently into hyperarousal or shutting down into hyperarousal. It emphasizes subtle physical movement, shaking, stretching, trembling, to physically complete the stress cycle that was aborted when the person froze in front of their screen.
And working alongside SE is the Safe and Sound protocol. The SSP approaches biological regulation through a completely different, yet highly complementary physiological pathway, the auditory system.
The SSP is essentially an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. It utilizes specially filtered music to train the nervous system.
How does music directly alter the autonomic nervous system?
It isolates the specific auditory frequencies of the human voice that are evolutionarily associated with safety and social engagement. According to Polyvagal Theory, the tiny striated muscles in the middle ear are neurologically linked directly to the ventral vagal complex in the brainstem.
Really? The muscles in the ear?
Yes. So by training the middle ear to tune into these specific mid-range frequencies of safety, the sound of a soothing voice, a lullaby, and simultaneously training it to tune out the low-frequency rumbles of predator sounds or the high-frequency screeches of distress, the SSP sends a direct, unmediated signal of safety to the brainstem.
Incredible.
It effectively signals the autonomic nervous system to downshift out of chronic sympathetic defense and back into a state of social engagement. It is passively resourcing the nervous system through the neuroception of safety delivered entirely via sound waves.
Beyond these intensive clinical protocols, the text outlines very specific practical biological tools that an individual can deploy completely independently in their daily life. These are interventions that do not require belief, faith, or complex cognitive processing. They only require sheer physical execution.
These are the daily hygiene practices for the nervous system.
First, breathwork, specifically the physiological sigh. This involves a double inhale through the nose, 2 sharp, quick sniffs.
Right, and the purpose of that double inhale is mechanical. When we are stressed, the tiny sacs in our lungs, the alveoli, collapse. The double sniff forces them to pop back open, maximizing the surface area for oxygen exchange.
Followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth. By making the exhale noticeably longer than the inhale, you directly trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. It forces the heart rate to slow down, offloading carbon dioxide and instantly reducing autonomic arousal.
Exactly.
Second, the use of sound. We saw David use this in the bathroom. Vocal toning, humming, chanting, or singing directly stimulates the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve runs directly alongside the vocal cords in the throat. The physical mechanical vibration of the vocal cords during a sustained hum massages the vagus nerve, sending a powerful calming electrical signal directly up to the brainstem.
Third, and perhaps most crucially for a society dealing with collective trauma, is co-regulation. Nervous systems are not isolated silos. They communicate and influence each other continuously via neuroception.
We are deeply social mammals. Being in the physical presence of a calm, grounded, and regulated nervous system biologically pulls a dysregulated system toward a state of calm. Your autonomic nervous system actually synchronizes with the heart rate, breathing cadence, and facial microexpressions of the people around you.
But this immense focus on biology raises a fundamental question about the future of mental health and how we process global events. If these somatic tools are so powerfully biological, if we are essentially debugging a computer at the base operating system level, do these interventions render traditional talk therapy obsolete during periods of acute crisis? Are we saying that meaning-making, philosophy, and narrative are irrelevant when the nervous system is hijacked by the news?
No, they are absolutely not irrelevant. They're simply inaccessible until a biological baseline is established. Top-down processing, analyzing the root cause of the trauma, making philosophical meaning of collective grief, constructing a coherent narrative about the state of the world is fundamentally impossible without bottom-up regulation.
Because the hardware is too hot.
If a client attempts to verbally process severe acute trauma while their nervous system is either vibrating in hyperarousal or collapsed in dorsal shutdown, they risk immediate severe re-traumatization.
It just reinforces the threat.
Yes. SE and the SSP do not replace talk therapy. They build the prerequisite physiological capacity to endure it. By widening the window of tolerance through somatic regulation, the individual builds the biological stamina required to actually tolerate processing explicit memories or terrifying global realities without dissociating or panicking. The physical body must feel safe before the cognitive mind can do its heavy lifting.
This brings us to the critical cognitive shift that must follow somatic regulation. We acknowledge that while somatic tools regulate the physical biology, the conscious mind must also relate to the crisis differently to prevent immediate re-traumatization the very next time a news alert flashes on the screen. The text draws a very sharp, defining line between two specific cognitive approaches: identification and recognition.
And the distinction between these two approaches dictates whether an individual spirals into chaos or maintains their grounding in the face of terrible news.
Let's break down identification first. This is the default state for most of us.
Identification is the cognitive collapse directly into the biological response. It is the conscious mind observing the racing heart and the shallow breath and saying, I am terrified. This terror is ME.
The identity becomes entirely fused with the physiological state of fear. And when that happens, the prefrontal cortex validates the amygdala's alarm. It tells the lower brain, yes, we are the terror. The threat is absolute. It reinforces the threat assessment, accelerating the downward spiral. You become the panic.
Recognition, however, operates from a place of mindful observation. It creates a critical distance. It is the conscious mind stating, terror is arising. The body is currently responding to a perceived threat. I am the awareness in which this terror appears.
I am the awareness. That is a massive shift. Recognition does not stop the heart from racing right away, but it creates crucial defining space around the biological activation. It prevents the cognitive mind from adding secondary psychological suffering, the story of doom, the projection into the future, to the primary physiological response.
Right. You observe the physiological storm without stepping into the center of it.
But we must explicitly dismantle a dangerous misconception here, something the clinical community often terms the spiritual bypass. There is this pervasive, incredibly toxic idea in wellness culture that if you just achieve enough mindfulness, enough enlightenment, or enough awareness, you will prevent your nervous system from activating at all. That you will remain perpetually blissfully zen in the face of literal global collapse.
The text absolutely destroys this notion. The physical body will still respond to a severe threat. A racing heart in the face of disaster is biological design, not psychological dysfunction.
Recognition does not magically eliminate the fear. It simply reveals that the individual is not the fear itself. It stops you from being entirely consumed by the neurochemical fire, even as you intimately feel the heat of it. It allows you to process the reality without being destroyed by it.
This leads directly to the comprehensive blueprint for true integration in the face of continuous crisis. It requires 4 distinct pillars operating simultaneously.
Let's lay out the blueprint.
First, recognition. The cognitive understanding that I am the awareness observing the panic, not the physiological panic itself. Second, regulation. The disciplined, immediate application of the somatic tools we discussed, the physiological sigh, the cold water exposure, the vocal toning to actively manage the physical biology. Third, action. Tending to the immediate environment and taking concrete physical steps within one's actual localized sphere of influence. And fourth, acceptance of limits. Acknowledging the brutal reality that individual regulation does not and cannot control collective global outcomes.
I have to challenge this concept of tending the immediate, specifically the third pillar of action. In the face of actual, literal, global collapse, escalating wars, profound economic ruin, systemic failure, isn't focusing on tending the immediate like doing the dishes or feeling your feet on the floor or organizing your desk just a form of willful ignorance? Are we just biohacking ourselves into a state of deep complacency and distracting ourselves while the world literally burns down around us?
The text provides a remarkably firm and completely unsentimental response to that exact critique. All the nervous system regulation in the world will not prevent collective macro-level events from occurring. Biology cannot stop an artillery shell. Humming will not halt inflation.
Then what is the point of tending the immediate?
Tending the immediate is not ignorance. It is the only viable strategy for functional survival. When an individual forcefully constrains their focus to feeling their feet on the ground or completing a tangible task in their immediate physical environment, they prevent their own nervous system from collapsing into dorsal vagal shutdown. If you do not regulate your biology, you simply add your own localized biological chaos to the overarching collective chaos.
You become a casualty before the threat even reaches your door.
Tending the immediate ensures that if and when you are actually required to act, if the crisis arrives on your physical doorstep, you are moving from a place of grounded truth, biological capacity, and present moment awareness, rather than reacting blindly from a state of paralyzed, contagious terror.
Which brings us to the final, brutal honesty of everything we've unpacked here today. We are, at our core, biological creatures attempting to process an unprecedented volume of digital trauma. Our nervous system's response to threat, the racing heart, the narrowed vision, the exhaustion, the intense mobilization, is a brilliant evolutionary feature, not a bug. But that exact feature is currently being ruthlessly exploited by a modern information environment that delivers the cues of life-threatening danger directly to our retinas 24 hours a day.
The sequence of survival in this unprecedented environment is strict and it is non-negotiable. First, you must understand the underlying biology. Recognize that your panic is a physiological reflex, an autonomic mandate, not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. Second, you must aggressively utilize practical bottom-up somatic tools, the breath, the cold immersion, the vocal vibration, to force biological regulation back into the system. Third, you must deploy cognitive recognition, observing the nervous system's activation without allowing your core identity to collapse into it. And finally, you must forcefully constrain your focus to the immediate physical present, the only space where you possess actual, tangible agency.